As people, we all love stories, right? We love stories. We love hearing stories. We love stories. For thousands of years, stories have been told and passed down for generations. We as people are storytelling people. Even before writing was invented, when it was only for the highly educated, people, what they would do instead of watching TV or going on Netflix or whatever it was, they would tell stories, right? In fact, that's how the Old Testament stories of creation and Adam and Eve and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and even Ruth, that's how they were all recorded. These histories of God's people, they were told as stories. People would gather around and someone would get up and tell the story. And even today we love stories. We tell stories to our friends about things that happened to us at work or while we were on vacation or a story about our past. We love to read stories in books. We love to listen to stories on podcasts or on audiobooks. We love to watch stories unfold in movies. And we even binge watch shows on Netflix because we want to know how the story's going to end, right? We keep watching because we want to see the end. And we even interpret the world around us through stories. The world about how we got here, why we're here today, why we live the lives we do, why we live in the culture that we do. We have cultural stories. We are storytelling people. And now there's some stories that we as people love more than others. And I would argue that our favorite kind of story is a good comeback story. It's a story about redemption. That's the kind of stories that we as people really like. I mean, just think about your favorite movie for a minute. What's your favorite movie? Think about that. Get that in your head for a minute. Odds are that in that movie, in your favorite movie, there's some point in the movie where everything seems lost. It seems like the worst thing is going to happen, that the bad guy is going to win, that everything is going to fall apart until the main character pulls out a win in the end when it seemed like everything was lost. They keep everything together just when it looked like it was all about to fall apart. I mean, that's how almost every action movie or superhero movie goes, right? The good guy wins at the last minute when it seems like everything is against them. And we love these movies in sports too, right? We love these stories in sports too. The 1980 U.S. hockey team that beat the world-dominating Russia in the Olympics to win gold, the miracle on ice. We love hearing about that story. Here in Indiana, we have the story of the Milan High School basketball team from the movie Hoosiers, right? That won the state championship. We love that story. We have the 2004 Boston Red Sox who won a World Series after 86 years. And I know you're sick of me talking about the Red Sox, but I could have talked about the Cubs, okay? So I don't know how Reds fans deal with Cubs, but, I could have brought them up too. I know, and during March Madness too. During March Madness, we always want that David team to beat the Goliath. We want that Cinderella team to go all the way. And we hope that we can watch a bracket-busting upset. Even kids' stories, like The Lion King, or Cinderella, or Snow White, or Sleeping Beauty, or Beauty and the Beast. They all feature some kind of comeback story or redemption narrative within the story. Even for kids, the best stories are stories about the comeback, about the underdog winning. They're stories about redemption. And we know we love these stories. But why do we love them? Why is it that we love stories of redemption? Stories about the main character persevering and winning against all odds. Why do we like those kinds of stories? I can tell you what I think. I think we love redemption stories because we want that to happen to us. We want some kind of redemption in our lives. We want our life to be transformed for the better, just like in that story that we know. We want some kind of redemption from our past, from our mistakes. We want to pull ourselves back up out of the dirt when we fall down, and we want to achieve what no one else thinks we can. We love redemption stories because we want that to happen to us. We want our losses, our hard knocks, and our past mistakes to mean something. We want our painful past to point us to a better, brighter future. We want that failed opportunity, that missed chance, that mistake that we made to be redeemed through a success or an achievement that no one saw coming. What's your redemption story? What's that story in your life that you want to happen? What's redemption look like for you? Maybe in a big way, maybe just in a little small way. Is it living up to be the person that your dad wanted you to be, even though it seemed like you were never good enough for him? Is it making up for your mistakes and your failures as a parent by being the best grandma or grandpa that you can be now? Does it look like you making up for that mistake that you made that blew up your life by doing it the right way this time? What's your redemption story look like? Redemption stories, they happen in more places than just in movies about heroes and sports teams. The Bible, it's actually full of redemption stories. Famous stories of real people, like the story of Joseph, sold by his brothers into slavery, only to welcome them into his house once he's Pharaoh's right-hand man in Egypt, and to actually save those same brothers who sold him away. Or Moses who went from being almost killed as a baby to living in Pharaoh's courts, to running away for murder, and then coming back to lead God's people out of Egypt. Or David, who went from shepherd boy to king over Israel. Or Paul the Apostle, who went from the most effective persecutor of Christianity to be the greatest missionary and evangelist that the church has ever seen. The book of Ruth, it's also a redemption story. Ruth, who went from being a foreign widow to being instrumental in redeeming Naomi's family name and keeping the family's legacy alive by becoming the mother of the son that would keep the family going. We are going to wrap up our journey through the story of Ruth today with this next development, this last thing that takes place in the book of Ruth. In the book, we read that Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. After Ruth had been childless in her last marriage, God finally gives her a son with Boaz. And not only is this a special day for Ruth and Boaz as parents, but it's the day of redemption for Naomi too. Naomi, after losing her husband, after losing her 2 sons, she now has redemption as a grandma. and based on what we know about ancient Israelite culture, we have a decent guess of how Naomi got to meet her grandson for the first time. If you're a grandparent or if you're a parent, I'm sure you remember meeting your grandkid or your child for the first time. This is how it probably went for Naomi. They were probably in their house, and Ruth was most likely in one room with her midwives giving birth, and Naomi was in another room with all the women from the town. They were all coming together to either support Naomi, to give her support and to praise the good thing that God was doing for her, or to give her comfort as well. And when the baby was born, they would bring the baby into Naomi and the other women, and Naomi would take the child into her arms. And this is what Naomi did. And it was more than just a grandma getting to meet her grandbaby for the first time. It was much bigger than that. This moment where Naomi holds this child on her lap is symbolic for her. First of all, Naomi, she had come back to her hometown of Bethlehem. And if you go back with me all the way to chapter 1 in the book of Ruth, what happened when Naomi came home? She came back with Ruth, with none of her other family with her, and all the people of the town said, "Is this Naomi? What's happened to her? Where's her husband? Where's her 2 sons? And why does she look like she's been through hell and back?" And Naomi responds and she says, "Don't call me Naomi. Because the name Naomi, that means pleasant. Instead, call me Mara, because Mara means bitter, and that's how God has dealt with me, bitterly." But now that bitterness for Naomi, it's come to an end. Because now what she has is this son, this symbolic son, someone to carry on the family name and to care for her. And the women of the town, they all recognize this, and they all say, Naomi, look, God has blessed you with a redeemer in this son, this baby boy who's going to provide for you. So what's happened now is that the responsibility to care for and to love Naomi in her old age, eventually it would be passed now from Boaz to this son once he was old enough to care for his mother and his grandma. And this son is called Obed in the story. And Obed is a name that means server or one who serves. And he gets this name because he would now serve Ruth and Naomi and care for them as the son in the family, as the man of the house. And so what we get is we get a full circle redemption story in the book of Ruth. The women who had come to Bethlehem empty-handed and without a future now had a full life and a future ahead of them because of this one baby boy. In other words, for Ruth and Naomi, everything was going to be okay. It's a great story, right? It's a nice happily ever after ending for Ruth and Naomi. The author of the story, he even puts this nice little bow on the end of it with baby Obed being born. That's where the story ends, and we can just look forward past the story to see how Ruth and Naomi were cared for, how Obed grew up and he had a family of his own, and everything ended perfectly. You couldn't ask for a better ending, right? But why do we have this story in the Bible? Right? I think that's a fair question. Why is this story in the Bible? Why does this story matter in the grand narrative between Genesis and Revelation? What's the big idea behind this story? Why does it matter? This story, out of however many others in the history of God's people, this one in particular, it gets written down and put in the Bible, and it's still there today. It's a story that has people that really don't get mentioned in too many other places in the Scripture. So, simply put, what's the point of this story? And the point of this story, it's found in the part of the Bible that is, for most people, probably the most boring, overlooked part of the Scriptures. It's the part of the Bible that almost everyone glosses over when they read it. The part of the Bible that was read for us just a few moments ago, and that was the genealogy at the end of Ruth. It's the verses with all the hard-to-pronounce names of people that we never hear about otherwise, right? This is the part that makes the story so important. It's so important because the unlikely redemption story of Ruth, it's the reason why David is born. And yeah, I mean that David, King David, David the son of Jesse, who also came from Bethlehem and was handpicked by God through the prophet Samuel to be king over Israel. David, who would go on to kill Goliath, escape from the fallen King Saul on a number of occasions when he tried to kill him, and unite God's people against their enemies to bring peace to Israel. David, who was a king after God's own heart, was also the son of the non-Israelite widow Ruth, a nobody. This story shows how David, an unlikely hero himself with his own amazing redemption story, follows in the footsteps of his own humble, faithful ancestors. The story of Ruth, what it does is it connects us from the unsteady and the turbulent period of the Judges, a time when people were turning away from God left and right. It connects us from that dark period to the rise of David, who is used by God to bring peace and faithfulness to his people. And that's reason enough to write and include this story in the Bible. But there's an even bigger reason to include the book of Ruth in the story of God and his people. And if you know your genealogies, then you know that Obed and David, they weren't the only baby boys born in Bethlehem to humble, faithful families who have a story of redemption to tell. My Hebrew and Old Testament professor from college, he once said this in class. He once said that you can find Jesus on every page of the Old Testament. And that is true for us today. Because we see on the final page of the last chapter of our story in the book of Ruth that the last word in our story not only points us to David, but it points us to Jesus himself. Jesus' story, it's a parallel to the story of this baby boy redeemer named Obed, who was born to serve and even to save his own family. We see over 1,000 years later that another baby would be born in Bethlehem who was also born to be a redeemer who would serve and save not just one family, but all people, including you and me standing here 2,000 years later today. Jesus is the redeemer that not only Ruth and Naomi needed, but that the entire world needed, who serves all of creation on the cross by dying and paying the redemption price of his blood and his life for you and for me. Ruth and Naomi, they were just hoping for a redeemer to take care of them and the land to be passed on to that generation, the next generation. But God gives them unimaginably more. God gives Ruth, the nobody Moabite widow, the greatest honor by putting her name in the family tree of not only David, but of God himself. God blessed Ruth with the gift of more than just a husband, a home, and a new life, but with the gift of salvation for all people through her descendant, Jesus. Jesus who sacrificed just like Boaz sacrificed in the story. Jesus who was born a baby boy of promise, who was born to be a redeemer just like Obed in the story. And he has his own redemption story to tell as well. Jesus has a redemption story to tell for all people because he went to hell and back for you and me, quite literally. He died and rose again so we could have life with him. And I'm sure all of us here today, I'm sure all of us have a redemption story that we'd like to see written into the book of our life, right? We all have that story where we wish our life could turn around in this area. Or we wish we could atone for this past mistake that we did. Wish we could turn this bad thing that happened to us into something positive. And you know what? Maybe God's going to give you that redemption. Maybe he's going to bless you so that you can get your happily ever after. Maybe you're going to get that, just like Ruth and Naomi got it. But even if what you hope for, what you pray for and work towards doesn't come true, even if you don't get the perfect bow-tied ending to the end of your personal redemption story, let me tell you today that you are already beyond blessed. You are beyond blessed because your redemption story, your true redemption story, it was finished 2,000 years ago when Jesus, our Redeemer, rose from the dead for the ultimate comeback, when he defeated sin, death, and every evil that tries to take you and I away from him. Your redemption story, the one that really matters in your life, the central narrative to your life, that story is already written. And you today have your redemption in the life, death, and resurrection of a baby boy born in Bethlehem named Jesus, who happens to be your God and your Redeemer. And just like Naomi got to see baby Obed, just like she got to hold him in her arms and hear him as he entered into the world, you and I come into this place so that we hear the story about Jesus, so that we hear the forgiveness of sins for you all here today, so that we can hear the promises of Jesus given to us, so that we can taste those promises in the meal that God has given us. Just like Naomi got to see her salvation, you and I, we get to see our salvation here today, and on the day when Jesus returns, we'll see that salvation come to fulfillment and completion. I mean, what better story could you ask for? And as we look back on our story of Ruth, a story of redemption, we have to ask, why is it that we love these kinds of stories? It's because the redemption story is our story as people of faith. You and I, we have been redeemed by Jesus, and so in every story of redemption, we can see ourselves and we can see Jesus and how he has redeemed us from our brokenness, our darkness, our sin, and even our death. We love redemption stories, whether it's stories like Ruth in the Bible or whether it's our favorite movie or other story that we take from the world. We love redemption stories because it is a reflection, it is an echo of the greatest redemption story that has ever been told. In every page of the Bible, we see the people and the events pointing to the greater person of Jesus and the event of his life, death, and resurrection. And in every story of loving sacrificial service in our culture and in our world, every story where the main character goes to hell and back for the people he loves, every story of death being undone and the good guy coming back at the end to win it all, in every redemption story, we can't help but see the reflection of the greater story of Jesus. We love redemption stories because we have a place in our hearts that desperately needs to be filled. A place that can only be filled by the story, redemption, and sacrifice and promises of Jesus. And we are beyond blessed today to know that the end of our story is already written. And it ends with your redemption from sin, death, the devil, and everything else in this world that you and I need redeeming from. Amen.